The laughter started before Delia Crowe even reached the center of town. It rolled across the dusty street like a cold wind, drawing heads toward the hitching posts outside the church. Men paused their work, women lowered their voices, even children stopped chasing one another through the dirt. Delia knew exactly why. A fresh notice had been nailed to the town bulletin board. Someone had written beneath it in thick charcoal letters, "Another year, another chance for Miss Crowe to stay unmarried." More laughter followed. Delia kept walking. She had spent nearly 15 years teaching the children of Red Hollow. She had helped boys learn to read and girls learn their sums. She had sat beside sickbeds, written letters for grieving families, and comforted frightened children during harsh winters. Yet none of that mattered today. To the town, she was simply the old maid schoolteacher, 36 years old, unmarried, forgotten. She stopped before the bulletin board. The cruel words stared back at her. Someone nearby snickered. "Maybe next year she'll find herself a husband," another voice answered. "Only if he's blind." A few people chuckled. Delia felt the familiar sting in her chest. Not anger, not anymore. Just exhaustion. She straightened her shoulders and walked away without a word. That should have been the worst moment of her day. It wasn't. Less than an hour later, a terrified scream echoed through town. People rushed toward the livestock pens near the edge of Main Street. Delia followed. A massive black stallion had broken free from a trader's wagon. The horse exploded through the street like a storm given legs. Men jumped aside. Children ran for cover. A wagon overturned. The stallion kicked at the air and sent a ranch hand sprawling into the dirt. No one could get near it, no one except the stranger who stood quietly beside the watering trough. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed like a trail-worn cowboy. Dust covered his coat, his hat shadowed most of his face. He watched the chaos without moving, as if he were studying a puzzle. Someone shouted at him, "Well, ain't you gonna help?" The stranger didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on the horse. Then something unexpected happened. The stallion charged directly toward the crowd. Women screamed, men scattered, and Delia Crowe stepped forward. The entire town froze. The schoolteacher had no business standing in front of a wild horse, yet she didn't run, she didn't scream, she simply looked at the animal. The stranger's expression changed for the first time. His eyes narrowed as if he suddenly recognized something nobody else could see. The stallion thundered closer, 20 feet, 10, 5. The crowd held its breath, and then the impossible happened. The horse stopped, silence swallowed the street. Nobody understood what they had just witnessed, not the townspeople, not the trader, not even the stranger. But as Delia slowly raised her hand toward the stallion's trembling neck, the cowboy removed his hat and stared at her with open disbelief. Because in that single moment, he realized there was far more to the forgotten schoolteacher than anyone in Red Hollow knew. And before sunset, a shocking discovery would force him to choose whether to trust her or watch the entire town face a disaster no one saw coming. The story of the wild stallion spread through Red Hollow before the sun had finished crossing the sky. By evening, nearly everyone had a version of what had happened. Some claimed Delia Crowe possessed a special gift with animals, others insisted the horse had simply grown tired. A few said it was nothing more than luck. Delia listened to the rumors the next morning while sweeping the steps outside the schoolhouse. No one came to ask her what had actually happened. No one asked how she had known the horse was frightened rather than angry. No one asked why she had stepped forward when others ran. People preferred their own stories. That was something Delia had learned years ago. Across the street, two women stood talking beside a wagon loaded with supplies. Their voices drifted through the cool morning air. "Poor thing," one said. "Who? Miss Crowe, she's nearly 40 now," the second woman sighed. "A woman needs a family," Delia continued sweeping. The women weren't trying to be cruel. That somehow made it worse. People always spoke about her as if she were standing somewhere far away instead of 20 yards from them, as if she were a problem to discuss rather than a person. When the school bell rang, she stepped inside and greeted her students with the same warm smile she always wore. None of the children knew how lonely their teacher sometimes felt. And Delia intended to keep it that way. The children deserved kindness, not the burdens of grown people. Hours later, after lessons ended, she walked toward Miller's general store to collect supplies for the classroom. The store sat in the center of town like the heart of Red Hollow itself. Everyone passed through its doors eventually. Farmers, ranchers, travelers, sheriffs, gossips, dreamers. The store knew more secrets than the church. As Delia entered, conversations paused briefly. Then resumed. She recognized the pattern. People were polite, friendly even, but there was always a small distance, an invisible wall. Storekeeper Orville Miller greeted her from behind the counter. "Afternoon, Miss Crowe." "Afternoon, Orville." He handed her a small box. "New chalk arrived yesterday, thank you." As she counted coins onto the counter, a group of ranchers nearby began discussing the stallion incident. One laughed. "Still can't believe that horse stopped for a schoolteacher." Another shrugged. "Probably a fluke." The third nodded. "Would have listened to any fool standing there." Delia said nothing. She paid for her supplies and turned toward the door. Then she noticed someone watching, the cowboy, the stranger from yesterday. He sat alone near the window, drinking coffee. His gaze wasn't mocking, it wasn't pitying, it was thoughtful, almost curious. For a brief moment their eyes met, then Delia looked away and continued outside. She had long ago stopped expecting anything from men, especially strangers. The cowboy watched her leave. Around him, the ranchers kept talking. One finally noticed his silence. "You saw it happen." "Horse nearly ran you over." The cowboy set down his cup. "It wasn't luck." The table grew quiet. "What do you mean?" He glanced toward the door Delia had just passed through. "That horse was panicking, so she knew it." The ranchers exchanged uncertain looks. The cowboy continued. "She approached from an angle that didn't threaten it." Nobody answered. He took another sip. "She knew exactly what she was doing." The men shifted uncomfortably. It was easier to believe in luck than competence. Especially when the competence belonged to a woman they had spent years overlooking. Outside, Delia crossed town carrying her supplies. She didn't know the stranger had defended her. She didn't know he had noticed details others missed. She only knew another lonely evening awaited her. Her small house stood at the edge of town beside a cottonwood grove. It was neat, quiet, orderly, much like her life. After supper, she lit a lamp and settled at her desk. Stacks of notebooks waited to be graded. Beside them rested an old leather journal. Delia opened it carefully. Inside were pages filled with sketches, not drawings of people, not landscapes, maps, water routes, soil notes, weather records, livestock observations. Years of careful information gathered across the surrounding valley. Most people thought she spent all her time teaching. Few realized she had spent more than a decade studying the land itself. She recorded rainfall, tracked drought patterns, noted river changes, measured grazing conditions. The habit had begun as curiosity. Over time it had become something far greater: knowledge. Knowledge nobody valued because nobody knew it existed. Delia turned to a recent page. A troubled expression crossed her face. Something she'd noticed weeks ago continued bothering her. The creek feeding several ranches was dropping faster than normal. Much faster. The pattern didn't make sense, not yet, but something was wrong, very wrong. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. Inside, Delia stared at her notes. A difficult question lingered in her mind. If her observations were correct, Red Hollow might soon face a problem far bigger than anyone imagined. And the town was unlikely to listen to the woman they barely listened to already. Meanwhile, across town, the stranger sat alone on the porch of the boarding house. In his hands rested a folded paper. A ranch contract, a reason for coming to Red Hollow, yet his thoughts kept returning to the schoolteacher, not because she was beautiful, not because she was lonely, but because she had done something that didn't fit the town's opinion of her. And whenever a town was wrong about someone, there was usually a story behind it. The cowboy intended to find out what that story was. The stranger's name was Callum Reed. He had spent most of his life driving cattle across rough country, surviving storms, droughts, and more than a few bad decisions. He trusted actions more than words. And what he had seen in the street 3 days earlier continued to bother him, not because it was strange, because it wasn't. Delia Crowe had acted like someone who understood animals. Someone with experience, someone who knew how fear moved through a creature's mind. Yet nobody in Red Hollow spoke of her that way. The town spoke of her as if she existed only inside the schoolhouse. Callum had learned long ago that when facts and reputation didn't match, one of them was usually wrong. So he began paying attention. The opportunity came sooner than expected. A supply wagon arrived late one afternoon carrying goods for several ranches outside town. As usual, half of Red Hollow gathered near Miller's general store. The arrival of supplies always attracted attention. Farmers checked seed orders, families collected household items, children hoped for candy, and adults searched for news from distant places. Callum stood beside a stack of flour sacks while the wagon driver unloaded crates. Nearby, Delia was purchasing school materials. Nobody paid much attention to her. That changed when the wagon driver suddenly cursed. A wheel had cracked. The heavily loaded wagon tilted dangerously. Several crates shifted. One slid toward the edge. The driver grabbed for it. Too late, the crate crashed to the ground. Glass shattered. A groan rose from the crowd. The driver removed his hat and wiped sweat from his forehead. That was medicine? The mood changed immediately. Medicine deliveries were rare. Replacing them could take weeks. The driver stared at the damaged wagon. "I can't move this load like this." Several men inspected the broken wheel. Suggestions came quickly. Most were useless. Some argued, others blamed the road conditions. Minutes passed. Nothing improved. Then Delia stepped forward. "May I see it?" The men exchanged looks. One shrugged. "Suit yourself." Delia crouched beside the wheel. She studied the damaged spokes carefully. Her eyes moved from the axle to the wagon bed. Then she examined the way the cargo had been stacked. Callum watched silently. The crowd expected her to step away after a few moments. Instead she stood. "The wheel isn't the main problem." The driver frowned. "What?" She pointed toward the rear cargo section. "Your weight is uneven." Several men looked confused. Delia continued. "The right side is carrying far more weight than the left." One rancher laughed. "What difference does that make?" She calmly met his gaze. "The difference is that the wheel broke because it carried more strain than it was designed to handle." The laughter faded. Delia walked to the wagon. She shifted several crates, moved 2 barrels, adjusted a stack of feed sacks. Then she stepped back. "Now look." The driver stared. His eyes widened. The wagon sat noticeably straighter. Callum crossed his arms. "Interesting, very interesting." The driver scratched his beard. "How'd you know that?" Delia answered simply. "My father hauled freight wagons when I was young." Nobody had ever heard her mention it. She continued. "I spent years helping him load supplies." The crowd exchanged surprised looks. The driver slowly nodded. "Reckon you may have saved the rest of the cargo." For a brief moment, Delia almost smiled. Then someone nearby spoke. "Well, that's useful, I suppose." The words sounded harmless, yet Callum noticed something. The compliment immediately shifted into dismissal. As if people were uncomfortable giving her full credit. As if recognizing her skill somehow threatened the story they preferred to believe. The schoolteacher, the old maid, the lonely woman. Those labels were easier than admitting she might know things they didn't. Delia returned to collecting her supplies. The crowd quickly moved on. The incident was forgotten almost as soon as it happened. Everyone forgot, except Callum. Later that week, he discovered something even more surprising. Heavy clouds gathered over Red Hollow one afternoon. Farmers welcomed the possibility of rain. The valley had been unusually dry. At Miller's general store, townspeople discussed the weather while waiting for the storm. Delia stood near a shelf of lantern oil. Callum entered just as she was speaking quietly to Orville Miller. "You should prepare extra water barrels." Orville blinked. "For rain?" "No." Her expression remained serious. "For shortage." Callum slowed his steps. "Shortage?" Orville frowned. "We're dry every summer. This is different." "How?" Delia hesitated. Most people already ignored her concerns. "Still," she answered, "the creek is falling too quickly." Orville shrugged. "Probably temporary." "It isn't." Something in her voice caught Callum's attention, not fear, certainty, the kind that came from evidence. "How can you know?" Orville asked. Delia glanced around the store. Several customers were listening now. "I've been tracking water levels for years," a rancher laughed. "Why would a schoolteacher do that?" The question carried more ridicule than curiosity. Delia ignored it. "I compare rainfall, runoff, and seasonal patterns." The rancher chuckled again. "Sounds mighty complicated." A few people smiled. Callum didn't. He was watching Delia, watching the way she held herself, the way she refused to become angry. The way she remained calm despite being dismissed. Most people would have walked away. Delia simply gathered her purchases. Before leaving, she looked at Orville. "Store extra water anyway." Then she stepped outside. The bell above the door jingled behind her. Silence lingered for several seconds. Finally, someone laughed. "She's worrying over nothing," others agreed. Conversation returned to normal. Only Callum remained thoughtful, because he had seen the notebook sticking from Delia's satchel. Pages filled with measurements, dates, numbers, observations, not guesses, records, years of them. That evening he found himself riding past the schoolhouse. A lamp glowed through the window. Inside, Delia sat alone at her desk, studying maps, making notes, working long after everyone else had gone home. Most of Red Hollow believed she was simply a lonely schoolteacher filling empty evenings. Callum was beginning to suspect something very different. And when a sudden discovery near the creek the next morning confirmed Delia's fears, he would be forced to ask a question no one else seemed willing to ask. What if the most capable person in Red Hollow was the woman everyone kept overlooking? The next morning, Callum rode north toward the creek that supplied much of the valley. At first, everything appeared normal. Cottonwoods lined the banks, grass swayed gently in the breeze, birds moved through the branches overhead. But as he continued upstream, he began noticing signs that matched Delia's warnings. The water level was lower than it should have been, much lower. Large stones that normally remained hidden beneath the surface now sat exposed to the sun. Near a bend in the creek, Callum dismounted and examined the shoreline. Fresh mud, recent disturbances. Something wasn't right. Then he found it. A crude diversion channel had been dug farther upstream. Someone had redirected part of the water flow, not enough to draw immediate attention, but enough to slowly reduce the amount reaching Red Hollow. Callum stared at the channel. Suddenly Delia's concern no longer sounded unreasonable, it sounded accurate. By afternoon, he was standing outside the schoolhouse. The final bell had rung. Children poured through the doorway, laughing as they raced toward home. A few minutes later, Delia emerged carrying a stack of notebooks. She looked surprised to find him waiting. "Miss Crowe, Mr. Reed." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Callum removed his hat. "I owe you an apology," Delia blinked. "For what?" "For not believing you sooner." A faint crease appeared between her brows. "I don't understand." "I checked the creek." Her expression changed instantly, not triumph, concern. "What did you find?" "A diversion channel," she slowly exhaled. As if a fear she'd been carrying had finally been confirmed. "I was hoping I was wrong." "So was I." For several seconds they stood in silence. Then Delia asked the question that mattered most. "Did anyone else see it?" Callum shook his head. "Not yet." She looked toward town. Already she seemed to be thinking several steps ahead, calculating consequences, possible solutions. Callum noticed something. Most people spoke first and thought later. Delia did the opposite. Finally, she said, "If too much water continues disappearing, several ranches will struggle before summer ends." "That's what I figured." Her eyes moved back to him. "You actually listened?" The words were simple, yet something about them struck him, as if being heard was unusual for her. Maybe it was. "We should show someone," Callum said. Delia gave a small nod. "Then we'd better bring proof." The following days forced them together, not by choice, by necessity, to convince the town they needed evidence. That meant gathering measurements, inspecting water levels, and documenting changes throughout the valley. Many evenings found them riding together beyond the town limits. The work itself wasn't easy. Yet neither seemed eager to avoid it. One afternoon they stopped near a shallow crossing. Delia knelt beside the water and made notes in her journal. Callum watched her work. "You've been keeping records a long time, almost 12 years. 12, she nodded. My students used to help collect rainfall measurements." Callum laughed softly. "School children measuring weather, they enjoyed it." A rare smile touched her face. Most of them preferred being outside to sitting at a desk. He found himself smiling too. The expression suited her not because it transformed her, because it revealed something that was usually hidden. For a brief moment she looked lighter, less burdened, less alone. Later, while riding back toward town, they passed a stranded wagon stuck in deep mud. A family stood beside it looking worried. Without hesitation, Delia guided her horse toward them. "Need help?" the father nodded. Within minutes she was organizing everyone. Children gathered stones, the mother cleared debris. Callum repositioned the wagon team. Together they freed the wheels. The grateful family thanked them repeatedly. As they continued down the road, Callum shook his head. "What? You didn't hesitate." Delia looked confused. "They needed help. Most people would have ridden past." She considered that. "Most people are busy. You were busy." A faint smile appeared. "Apparently not too busy." Callum found himself laughing. The sound surprised both of them because neither had laughed much during recent years. The friendship developing between them was quiet. Neither named it, neither rushed it, but trust was growing, so was admiration. One evening, after a long day of inspections, they stopped on a ridge overlooking the valley. The setting sun painted the grasslands gold. Below them, Red Hollow looked small, peaceful, fragile. Delia studied the town. "My students think I know everything." Callum glanced at her. "Do you?" A genuine laugh escaped her. "No." The sound carried warmth, then her expression softened. "I just try not to let them see when I'm afraid." That answer lingered with him. Because it sounded familiar. He had spent years doing the same thing. After a moment he asked quietly, "What are you afraid of now?" Delia's gaze remained fixed on the valley. "That nobody will listen until it's too late." Callum followed her eyes toward the creek. He understood. The evidence was growing, the danger was real. Yet convincing the town would be another matter entirely. People rarely welcomed uncomfortable truths, especially when those truths came from someone they had already decided to underestimate. A week later, Delia and Callum presented their findings to several ranch owners. The response was worse than either expected. Some listened politely, others dismissed the warnings outright. One influential rancher, Horace Vance, openly challenged them. "You expect us to believe a schoolteacher's notebook over common sense?" Several men nodded. Delia remained calm. "The records speak for themselves," Horace smirked. "Records don't run ranches." The meeting ended without action. As the crowd dispersed, Delia quietly gathered her papers. Callum could see the disappointment she tried to hide, not because people disagreed, because they refused to look. Outside, dusk settled over Red Hollow. For the first time since they'd begun working together, neither spoke during the walk back toward town, but both knew the same thing. Someone was responsible for diverting that water. Someone powerful enough that others were unwilling to question them. And if Delia's calculations were correct, the valley had far less time than anyone realized. The real conflict was no longer the water. It was whether the truth would be allowed to reach the people who needed it most. For a few days after the meeting, Red Hollow carried on as though nothing had happened. Children attended school. Ranchers worked their herds. Customers filled Miller's general store. Church bells rang on Sunday. Life looked normal, but beneath the surface something had changed. Rumors had begun spreading. And rumors often traveled faster than truth. Delia first noticed it when conversations stopped as she entered the general store, not completely, just long enough. The pause was brief but unmistakable. She had experienced it before. People weren't looking at her with sympathy anymore, they were looking at her with suspicion. Orville Miller greeted her as usual, but even he seemed uneasy. "You hear what folks are saying?" Delia set a list of supplies on the counter. "I've heard enough rumors in my life." Orville rubbed the back of his neck. "These are different. That afternoon she discovered exactly how different. A notice had appeared outside the town hall. Someone claimed that Delia's warnings about the creek were causing unnecessary panic. Another claimed she was exaggerating problems to gain attention. A third suggested she had invented evidence altogether. None of the accusations carried a signature, yet everyone knew who benefited from them: Horace Vance, the wealthiest ranch owner in the valley. The same man who had publicly rejected her findings. Delia stood before the notice board while townspeople passed by. Some avoided looking at her, others looked away quickly, a few openly stared. The humiliation burned, not because strangers doubted her, because she had spent years serving this town honestly. Years, and now people were willing to believe she had lied. A familiar voice spoke behind her. "They're wrong." She turned. Callum stood there, his expression was hard, not angry, protective. Delia looked back at the notice. "Most of them don't think so." "I do." The certainty in his voice almost weakened her resolve, almost, but Delia Crowe had survived disappointment before. She folded the paper calmly and handed it back to the board. "It doesn't matter." "It matters." "No," she faced him. "If I spend my energy fighting rumors, I won't have any left for solving the actual problem." Callum studied her. Even wounded, she remained focused. Even humiliated, she refused to become bitter. It was one more reason he respected her. Unfortunately, the situation worsened. 2 days later, another discovery shocked the town. Several ranches reported unusually low water levels. Concern finally began spreading. Yet instead of admitting Delia had been right, some people searched for someone to blame, and blame often follows the easiest target. At a public gathering outside the church, Horace Vance seized his opportunity. Dozens of townspeople stood listening. Delia had come only to share new measurements, nothing more. But Horace had other plans. He stepped forward before she could speak. "Before we hear another lecture," he announced loudly, "perhaps we should ask why Miss Crowe spent years collecting information nobody requested." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Delia remained still. Horace continued. "Seems strange, doesn't it?" His voice carried across the gathering, almost like she wanted influence. Several people shifted uncomfortably. Callum's jaw tightened, but Delia raised a hand slightly. A silent request for him not to intervene. Horace wasn't finished. "Maybe she enjoys having folks depend on her." The accusation hung in the air, cruel, unfair, and effective, because doubt is easy to plant. The crowd didn't cheer, they didn't applaud. Yet neither did they defend her. That silence hurt more than any insult. Delia looked across the faces she had known for years, parents of former students, neighbors, friends. People she had helped countless times. Most lowered their eyes. No one stepped forward. No one spoke. The loneliness of that moment felt heavier than anything she had carried before. Finally, Delia addressed the crowd. Her voice remained calm, steady, dignified. "I never collected those records for influence," silence answered. "I collected them because understanding our valley helps protect it." A few people listened, others looked uncertain. Horace folded his arms. "Convenient explanation." For the first time, pain flashed across Delia's face, only briefly, but Callum saw it. So did several others, yet she refused to argue further, refused to beg for trust. Refused to defend herself beyond the truth. She gathered her notes, then she walked away, head high, back straight, dignity intact, even as whispers followed her. That evening she sat alone in her small house. The journal rested open before her. Years of work filled those pages, years of careful observation. And now much of the town believed she had ulterior motives. For the first time in a long while, doubt crept into her heart, not doubt about the evidence, doubt about whether the truth would matter. A knock sounded at the door. She already knew who it was. Callum entered when invited. Neither spoke immediately. Finally, he placed something on the table, a folded document. She opened it. Inside were fresh measurements, additional evidence, proof supporting everything she had claimed. "You went back?" she asked. He nodded. "Twice." Delia stared at the papers. "Why?" Callum met her eyes. "Because he wanted her to understand something, something few people had ever said aloud. Because I trust your judgment." The room fell quiet. The words seemed simple. Yet they reached a place inside her that years of praise never had. Most people appreciated what she did, very few trusted what she knew. For a moment neither looked away, then Callum spoke again. "We still have a problem," Delia nodded. "Horace, and whoever's helping him." The evidence now pointed toward something larger than a simple water shortage. Someone had deliberately redirected the creek, someone was hiding the truth, and someone powerful was working hard to keep the town from listening. What neither of them knew was that a violent summer storm was already moving toward the valley. And when it arrived, it would expose secrets far more dangerous than stolen water. 3 days later, the storm arrived. It swept down from the mountains with a force few people in Red Hollow had ever witnessed. The morning began with dark clouds gathering beyond the western ridges. By noon, the sky had turned nearly black, wind bent trees, dust spiraled through the streets, animals grew restless. Even before the first rain fell, Delia felt a knot forming in her stomach. Something wasn't right. She stood beneath the porch roof of the schoolhouse watching the clouds roll across the valley. The pattern troubled her. Years of studying weather and water had taught her to recognize danger. This storm wasn't the problem. What it would do to the creek was. A rider appeared through the blowing dust. Callum. He pulled his horse to a stop. "Delia," she hurried toward him. "What is it?" The diversion channel, her heart sank. "What about it?" "The storm's heading straight for it." For a moment, neither spoke. Then they both reached the same conclusion. The artificial channel wasn't built to handle heavy runoff. If enough rain hit the valley, the weakened banks could collapse. And if they collapsed, a sudden flood could surge directly toward Red Hollow. Delia turned pale. "We need to warn everyone." They rode hard toward town. Church bells began ringing as the first sheets of rain swept across the valley. People rushed indoors. Store owners secured windows. Wagons were pulled beneath shelter. Few understood the real danger. At the town hall, Delia and Callum gathered anyone willing to listen. Rain hammered the roof overhead. Wind rattled the walls. "We don't have much time," Delia said. Several ranchers looked skeptical. Horace Vance stood near the back of the room. His expression was tense, almost fearful. Callum stepped forward. "We found the diversion channel." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Delia continued. "If the banks fail, floodwater could be redirected straight into town." One man frowned. "How do you know?" Before Delia could answer, thunder shook the building. The doors burst open. A drenched ranch hand stumbled inside. "Pine Creek's overflowing." The room exploded into chaos. People shouted questions, others rushed outside. Several men ran toward the stables. Fear spread faster than the storm itself. Then another rider arrived. His horse was lathered with sweat despite the rain. "The upper bank's breaking." Silence hit the room. The danger was no longer theoretical. It was coming, fast. Panic threatened to take over. But Delia's mind was already working. Calculating, remembering, years of observations flashed through her thoughts. Water flow, terrain, old creek routes, abandoned drainage paths. Then she remembered something, an old flood map drawn decades earlier, a map she had copied into her journal years ago. She grabbed her satchel. "Callum," he immediately stepped beside her. "I know how to stop it." Everyone turned, including Horace. Delia spread the map across a table. Rain drummed against the windows. "The flood won't hit town if we reopen this channel." She pointed toward a narrow depression running south of Red Hollow. Several older residents leaned closer. One gasped. "The old overflow basin," Delia nodded. "It used to carry excess water away from town." A rancher stared at the map. "I haven't seen that route since I was a boy." "It's still there." Callum studied the drawing. "If we clear it, the flood can spread into open grazing land." "Exactly." The room fell quiet. People realized what they were hearing. The solution, the one thing that could save the town, had come from the woman they spent years overlooking. Delia didn't pause. "We need wagons, shovels, horses, and every able-bodied person." For a second nobody moved. Then Callum raised his voice. "You heard her." The hesitation vanished. Men rushed outside. Women organized supplies, young boys carried tools. The entire town sprang into motion. For the next 2 hours, Red Hollow fought the storm. Rain poured relentlessly. mud swallowed boots. Wind howled across the valley. Delia moved through the chaos with remarkable calm. She directed work crews, checked water levels, adjusted plans when conditions changed. People listened. Not because she demanded authority, because she had earned it. As darkness approached, a distant roar echoed across the valley. The flood. Several townspeople froze. A wall of water surged through the damaged diversion channel, straight toward Red Hollow. For one terrible moment it seemed too late, then the newly opened overflow basin caught the surge. Water rushed into the old channel, spreading across open land, turning away from homes, away from businesses, away from the schoolhouse, away from the general store. The flood thundered past. But the town remained standing. A stunned silence settled over the valley. Slowly people realized what had happened. They were safe. Children emerged from buildings, families embraced. Exhausted workers sank into the mud, and in the middle of it all stood Delia Crowe, covered in rain, covered in dirt, quiet as ever, yet everyone was looking at her now, not the old maid. Not the lonely schoolteacher, not the woman people pitied, the woman who had saved Red Hollow. Then another truth emerged. As crews inspected the damaged diversion channel, they discovered records linking the construction to Horace Vance. For months he had secretly redirected water toward land he intended to purchase cheaply once neighboring ranches struggled. His scheme had created the entire crisis. The revelation spread rapidly. People stared at him in disbelief. Horace offered excuses, none mattered, the evidence was overwhelming. The same records he had mocked had exposed him. The same woman he had humiliated had revealed the truth. By nightfall, Horace stood alone, while Delia stood surrounded by grateful townspeople, but the most important moment was still to come. Because for the first time in many years, Red Hollow was finally ready to see her, truly see her. The morning after the flood dawned bright and clear. Sunlight spilled across the valley as if the storm had never existed. But Red Hollow knew better. Every muddy street, every damaged fence, every exhausted face carried evidence of what had happened. And of who had prevented something far worse. For once, the town wasn't speaking in rumors, it was speaking in gratitude. People gathered throughout the day to repair damage and help neighbors recover. Again and again, Delia heard the same words. Thank you, words she wasn't accustomed to hearing. At least not like this, not from adults, not from people who finally understood what she had done. Near midday, she stopped outside Miller's General Store. The familiar building looked much the same as it always had, yet something felt different. Perhaps it was the way people greeted her, perhaps it was the smiles. Or perhaps it was the simple fact that nobody was looking past her anymore. Orville Miller stepped onto the porch carrying a small box. Miss Crowe, she smiled. Morning, Orville, he cleared his throat awkwardly. You know, all these years folks kept saying this town couldn't function without the store. Delia glanced at the building. It does seem to be the center of things. Orville shook his head. No, his voice softened. Turns out we were wrong. She looked at him curiously. Orville gestured toward the town. The person holding everything together wasn't the store. Emotion tightened her chest. Before she could answer, several townspeople nearby nodded in agreement, one by one, quietly, sincerely. Delia suddenly found herself unable to speak, because after years of being overlooked, she was receiving something she had never expected. Recognition, not for being useful, not for being dependable. For being valued. The realization nearly brought tears to her eyes. A few hours later, church bells rang, not for an emergency, not for a funeral, for a community gathering. Nearly the entire town attended. Families filled the benches. Children crowded near the front. Farmers, ranchers, shopkeepers, and laborers stood shoulder to shoulder. Delia had no idea why everyone had been invited until she arrived. The moment she entered, the room fell silent. Then people stood, every one of them. Delia froze. She looked around in confusion. Faces she had known for years smiled back at her. Former students, parents, neighbors, friends, people who had doubted her, people who had ignored her, people who now understood. The town pastor stepped forward. Miss Crowe, his voice echoed softly through the church. Red Hollow owes you more than thanks, Delia's eyes filled, the pastor continued. When others ignored warning signs, you paid attention. When others doubted, you persisted. When others panicked, you led, he smiled. And when our town needed wisdom, courage, and calm judgment, you provided all three. The church erupted into applause, not polite applause, not obligatory applause. The kind that comes from genuine respect. Delia lowered her head briefly, overwhelmed. Across the room, Callum watched her. The applause continued, but his attention never left her. Because he remembered the woman standing alone before the bulletin board, the woman mocked for being unmarried, the woman nobody truly saw, and he realized something. He couldn't imagine Red Hollow without her. More importantly, he couldn't imagine his own future without her. When the applause finally faded, the pastor smiled. I believe someone else would like to say a few words. Delia looked up, confused, then she saw Callum rising from his seat. A ripple of curiosity moved through the church. Callum walked toward the front, his boots echoed softly against the wooden floor. For a moment, he simply stood beside her, then he faced the crowd. Most people expected a short speech. Perhaps a few words of gratitude. Instead, Callum looked directly at Delia and spoke from the heart. When I arrived in Red Hollow, people told me many things about Miss Crowe. A few embarrassed smiles appeared. Callum continued. They told me she was lonely. They told me she was unmarried. They told me she was ordinary. The room grew very quiet. They were wrong, no one argued, because everyone knew it was true. Callum's eyes never left Delia. What I found was a woman who notices what others miss. A woman who serves without asking for praise. A woman who stands firm when standing alone would be easier. Emotion shimmered in Delia's eyes. Callum took a slow breath, then said the words everyone would remember. The finest person in this valley has been standing here all along. Silence filled the church, warm, powerful, certain. Callum stepped closer, not because he needed rescuing, not because he needed help, not because she was convenient, but because he knew her worth, and wanted everyone else to know he knew it too. I respect you, Delia Crowe, his voice softened, more than anyone I've ever met. A tear slipped down her cheek. I trust you, another followed. And if you'll allow it, a faint smile touched his face. I'd like to spend the rest of my life proving that I see exactly who you are. The church became so quiet that nobody seemed willing to breathe. Delia looked at him, really looked at him. The man who had listened when others dismissed. The man who had believed when others doubted. The man who had respected her before he ever loved her. For several seconds she couldn't speak. Then she smiled through her tears, a genuine smile, the kind she had hidden away for years. I'd like that very much. Laughter and applause filled the church. Children cheered, families smiled. Even some of the toughest ranchers wiped their eyes because everyone understood what made the moment special. It wasn't simply romance, it was recognition, the kind every person hopes for. To be seen, to be understood, to be valued for who they truly are. Weeks later, life in Red Hollow settled into a new rhythm. The creek flowed normally again, the valley recovered. And the general store remained the center of town life. Yet visitors often noticed something interesting. Whenever difficult questions arose, people no longer asked who might know the answer. They already knew, because the woman they once overlooked had earned the trust of an entire community. And on many evenings, townspeople could be seen smiling as Callum Reed walked beside Delia Crowe through the streets of Red Hollow, not leading her, not rescuing her, walking beside her, as an equal. As a partner, as the woman whose worth had always been there, waiting for the world to finally see it.